Welcome back to my sustainability journey. My name is Craig and I'm on a mission to live a more sustainable urban lifestyle with a transition into creating my own homestead from scratch out in the little Karoo here in South Africa. What we are discussing today is containers and pots, bags. How productive can they really be within an urban space? And why is this important for us to discuss? Well, a lot of us now have to start looking at the options like renting, smaller spaces, smaller gardens, no space for gardens. So the only option is to grow in containers, bags, pots, anything that we possibly can, especially if you are renting. And that is the transition that I am in right now as we moved from Cape Town to George so that we can build our forever homestead out in the little Karoo. We are renting and pots it is. But just how productive can it be? That is what we're going to be discussing today. So if you haven't watched my previous video, which was on 10 ways that you can save costs on your food bill in 2025, you should definitely give that a watch, because in there I discuss a whole bunch of things that you can look at doing this year and just in the years to come that'll be able to set you up for some food security, healthier food, reduced food costs, all of those things. And one of the things I mentioned there, which is very much applicable to growing food in containers and pots, is to firstly grow what you like to eat. If you don't like tomatoes or you don't eat lots of tomatoes, don't grow lots of tomatoes. That being said, one of the more productive varieties of food you can grow in containers, bags, are tomatoes. Right behind me I have 3 different tomato plants and they vary in size, flavor, ripeness, all of that. We eat a lot of tomatoes, so for us it makes complete sense. That being said, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 bags with tomatoes in, nothing more. And that gives us just enough to supplement meals where we need, that we don't have excess. So tomatoes are a really, really good option. And one of the other crops that do incredibly well in pots or containers are beetroots. And also something I mentioned in my previous video is that beetroots are an incredible multi-purpose crop. You would have heard, if you watched that video, that I constantly say use multi-purpose crops. Don't plant lettuce. Lettuce has one purpose. It bolts. It's a waste of space, in my opinion. Rather do something like beetroot, where you can use the leaves to replace lettuce. You can shred the bulbs up into shredded beetroot, put that into your salad. You're done. You get 2 purposes, 2 uses from the same space. And here we have, I think it's going to blow your mind, some monster beetroot, which has been grown in a bag, and this is grown at the base of a young apple tree. In this one I had 2, 4, 6, 8 beetroots in a small bag. Now if I pull this one out, look at this. It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And this one, I pulled its friend out next to it not too long ago, but this was grown in a pot. There are another 2 in there growing side by side. So what I do in pots is I put them in 2s. So I do, in any size pot, I'll do 4 opposite each other, which gives enough growing room in the areas next to it to expand. Anything more than 2 in a cluster in a pot just doesn't do really well. So if you put 2 next to each other, you can expect beetroots this size and bigger, which is, in my opinion, a really, really good use of space. Also look at multi-sowing or interplanting, intercropping. There are so many words for it. But this is the exact option of, we have a fruit tree, and at the base of the fruit tree, don't leave it open, don't just mulch it, plant. Remember, the tree's roots are going to the bottom of the pot. These roots are just below the surface. So they occupy different root zones, so you can quite easily grow multiple crops in the same pot with your trees. The next crop you should consider growing in pots are chillies. This is, I don't know what. It was labeled as a jalapeno. It is clearly not a jalapeno. I don't eat chilies, but my wife eats them by the truckload. So this is 2 plants, and these 2 plants have given us a huge huge amount of chilies. Chilies love growing in pots and they take up very little space. There are so many varieties, and if you're a chili fan or you just like a little hint of some additional flavor to your dishes, then chilies are a really great option. Once again, these are chilies planted at the base of a peach tree. So we're wasting absolutely no space. That is a crucial thing when it comes to growing in containers, is use of space and maximizing that. And the only way we can do that is to sow crops inside or amongst other crops so that we get the best out of the space that we have. Then something you absolutely have to consider planting in your containers, in your home garden, are berries. Raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, aronia berries, any berries. And why do I say that? Well, berries are just in general absolutely delicious. They're packed with nutrients and they're incredibly expensive. Fresh raspberries in the shop are very seasonal. Not that they're not here, but they're incredibly expensive. Here we have an abundance of raspberries, and me and the kids and my wife just regularly, as we walk past this bush, just pick a few here and there. We don't need to buy a tub full of raspberries and eat them all in one go, because the next day they're going to be off. We just pick them right off the tree. Oh, my dog is being very demanding. We just pick them right off the tree, eat them as we want to. For me personally, raspberry is the best flavored berry out of all of them. And I know we'll all have different opinions. I've done quite a few videos on raspberries in terms of how to feed them, foliar feeding, how to prune them, how to select canes. Because if we look at this bush behind me, it's getting unruly. But that's what happens. You select your canes in the winter. In the summer, those canes produce fruit and new canes come up. In winter, we need to thin those new canes so that we can continuously get a productive bush. I'm not going to go through everything in this video because you can go and watch those other ones, but I've given quite a bit of information on growing berries in containers. They're also super easy to propagate. So as the runners, the shoots come up on the sides, you just simply cut them, pull them out, put them in a new plant, and in a new pot, and you have new plants. That's what I've done with my raspberries, is I've divided them. And I'm going to be continuously dividing them because they're going to go into the homestead where I'm going to have a row of raspberries so we can freeze them and hopefully give some out to you as well. But raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, they're all doing incredibly well in containers. This might not look like much, but it is quite a lot. And these are my first round of dry beans that I have grown. These beans have been growing since early spring, and they are at the base of this fig tree, and they grow with abundance. They fix nitrogen into the soil, they create nice dense roots, and at the end of it they give us beautiful shelled dry beans. These I will use now for my midsummer planting, which will give me another crop of dry beans. I will put them into containers, let them dry, put them into a jar. And these beans are going to be able to last me through the winter season and for a really long time. And you would be surprised at just how many beans you can get from a single pot like this. You can do multiple crops of them, and they take very little space. They don't take nutrients from the soil, they actually put it back. Don't pull the roots out, cut it, put more compost on top, plant your next batch, and suddenly you're ending up with a whole bunch of dried beans that you don't need to buy, you don't need to pay for, that you can grow what you like. This is a Malawian variety. It's a beautiful green type bean. And yeah, I'm going to harvest all of these and plant the next crop. So beans do incredibly well in pots. They can also be interplanted with many other things. You can also do things like green beans. You can do runner beans, pole beans. I've actually, in the pear behind me, and I'm going to switch over to it. On this pear, you can see I've run it all up the support and it's running up the stem. Here are the beans that are now attached to the stem of the tree. So here I've used the supports plus the tree to allow the runner type beans to go up. And I've got beans all the way to the top of the pear tree. And I can just harvest the pods, do the next batch, and continuously get beans throughout the season, whether that's fresh or dry. Very little space. Yes, they are cheap, but it's one thing you don't need to worry about or buy. If you have beans, you will be forced to eat beans. They're very healthy, and yeah, beans are a brilliant choice to add into your container garden. The next thing that does incredibly well in pots and containers, excuse the African vuvuzela flying around, the hardy-da, they're going crazy. The next thing it does incredibly well in pots are herbs and greens. In front of you here, these yellow flowers, that's rocket. It's wild rocket. You can let it go. You can let the bees feast on the seeds, but then you can also eat all of these leaves that come up. You know rocket. Nice and peppery. Also a great addition to interplant rocket underneath things like tomatoes will keep aphids away. So there's a lot of interplanting options with something like rocket as well. Here in front of me, these purple flowers, these are garlic chives, or you can also just have normal chives. These flowers are amazing, infused in an olive oil or an oil. So that's another good option. But just having chives in your homemade cheeses, in any of your dishes, there are a lot of options. Then you got things like thyme over here, rosemary over there. We have different types of mint. They all do incredibly well in pots, and I would actually say they do better in pots than they do in the ground because they get this correct amount of moisture. If you're looking at herbs and containers and pots are best friends and go incredibly well together. Then one of the most exciting things for me to grow in pots are fruit trees. Fruit trees love pots. I have citrus right here next to me, and this is a Satsuma Nachi, which means very, very early on in the winter or autumn, I'm going to start getting citrus. They are setting beautifully, but at the same time, I'm getting summer fruit in apples. This is the Anna apple, and I've got a whole bunch of apples from this small tree. It'll produce more and more every year. And as with the other plants, this one at the base is completely covered with dry beans. These are bush beans, but nonetheless, I'm using the space. I'm keeping the soil covered. I'm putting roots in the ground. I'm taking nitrogen, putting it back in the soil. And I'm also getting a lot of new growth in this tree, plus fruit. So let this be testament to growing fruit trees in pots with other crops at the base. I absolutely love things like apples, guavas, pears. What else do I have? Figs. Figs love growing in containers. Peaches, nectarines, plums, apricots, they can all grow in pots. Like with things like herbs, they actually do very well in pots because you can give a lot more control over nutrients, moisture, things like that. So if you haven't yet got into growing fruit trees in containers or pots, or you've been a little bit concerned about the space that you have, don't. Get a fruit tree in a big pot, use that. You can even grow an apple tree on your balcony in your apartment. The final thing I want to talk about is what generally doesn't do well in containers or pots. There are quite a few, but once again, you can make those things work. And it might be controversial to some, it might not be to others. Once again, this is an example of trial and error. If it works for you, amazing. I've just not found it to be incredibly productive for me. The first of which is pumpkins and squashes. I've tried and I've got some good growth, but not nearly as much as in the ground. If you've ever pulled a pumpkin or squash plant out the ground, you'll see those roots run for meters and meters. They have very, very big, dense root structures that get nutrients from wherever they can because it's a big vine with big fruit. So things like pumpkins and squashes, if you have small bush varieties like courgettes or patty pans, all of those bush type varieties, yes, you can grow those. But anything that's sprawling and bigger, you're going to kind of struggle with. The same with things like cucumbers. Can you grow them in pots or containers? Absolutely yes. There's no reason why you shouldn't. But I have found that growing cucumbers in containers, if the container isn't big enough, just doesn't give you nearly the amount of yield that you would if they're grown in the ground. Other things include sweet potatoes, but you can grow sweet potatoes in containers, given the container is big enough. Don't expect to put a runner or a cutting of sweet potato into a 30 centimeter pot and expect to have 4 kilos of sweet potatoes. It's just not going to happen. So if you want to do sweet potatoes in a pot, it needs to be a big 75 centimeter, 78, like a big pot where those roots can go down, the tubers can get long. So generally speaking, restricted spaces, things like that also don't work. Then in terms of bang for your buck, something like potatoes. Also, generally, you can get away with way more productive crops in the same amount of space. I'll tag it up for you as well, done trials, and I've got about 2.5 kilos from a couple of potatoes grown in pots. But I've always had way more success growing potatoes in the ground. They take a fair amount of time, and you only get a certain amount of tubers over all of that time. Where if you look at something like beetroot, tomatoes, chillies, even berries, brinjals, you're going to get way more on a more continuous time frame than you would potatoes. So that's also something to consider. Then there are a lot of others. These are just the most popular ones that I've spoken to you about. And we've got other things like kales that you can grow in pots. That's absolutely fine. Pretty much all of your leafy greens, any leafy greens can be grown in pots without any troubles. But once again, it all comes back down to what do you eat? What do you want to save money on? How do you want to become more self-sufficient and independent? And that's what you need to go with. So I hope this video has given you some inspiration into using the amount of space you have, no matter how big or small it is. Use every little bit of available space to grow something. Put a fruit tree on your balcony in your apartment. Nothing is stopping you from doing that. You can do it. Just make sure you find a self-fertile variety. Plant at the base, use intercropping, and make sure that you can use the space you have to grow an abundance of food in your pots or containers. It's really, really simple. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, please subscribe, please share it out to fellow like-minded growers. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the near future.